Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast you don't want to miss. You're about to get a sneak peek at what goes on behind the scenes with authors. We'll find out their secret recipe for creating a book. We'll tell you where they get their ideas, and you will get the inside scoop on their next project. Want to know more? We'll tell you where to find them on social media. Are you ready? Okay, let's meet today's author. Joining me today is B.C. Hedlund. She's here to talk about her novel, Consigned to Oblivion. Now, B.C. is an emerging writer. She's a busy high school student, she's a college student, and she's a musician. And she's also, this is her first novel, but she writes a blog, she writes poetry, she writes articles, and she writes short stories. B.C., it is such a pleasure to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You know, I'm curious. I'm a curious soul. And I wonder, you're a young person. Often when people begin to write, there's some kind of seminal event that happens in their life. There's a person that influences them. There's a family member that influences them somehow. How did you decide to become a writer?
That's a really hard question because I've been writing for as long as I can remember. I started coming up with little stories when I was like 5, and I just kind of went from there. So my parents really inspired creativity. They always wanted me and my sister to kind of just explore with things. So I really did that with writing.
I'm impressed with your body of work. I mean, you're a blogger, you're writing poetry, articles, short stories, you've written a novel. Writing a novel is no small task. I've written a novel myself, and I know that it's not easy. Where did the idea for Consigned to Oblivion come from?
It started from a 7th grade writing project, actually. And we had to write a short story, so we could kind of have the freedom to do whatever we wanted with it. And I wrote this short story, which is very basically the plot of the novel. I, of course, wrote a 6-page story that was only supposed to be 3 pages, so I remember that particularly. But it was really just the basic idea of going off into this world that you don't really know and just kind of finding yourself. And I took that basic idea from that 6-page story and turned it into what is now Consigned to Oblivion.
What's your writing process like? I mean, many authors will talk about that. For example, when I wrote fiction, I kept a pad beside my bed because I would dream about the characters and I would dream about situations, and I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and if I didn't immediately get up and write down what I just dreamed, by the time I woke up in the morning, it was gone. When I sat down at the keyboard to start to transcribe that, it was like a movie started in my head. What's it like for you?
My writing is kind of all over the place because I'll do that a lot because I get most of my ideas at night, so I'll stay up till like 2 a.m. writing sometimes and just let it just flow into whatever happens. I know a lot of people talk about planning, and I've done that for a couple of my projects because sometimes you really have to plan if there's a lot of like complexity. But with this book, it kind of just, I wrote it first and then I went back and made sure all the pieces fit together.
You're absolutely right. I've interviewed authors who, like Jeff Deaver, who sits down and he outlines everything that's going to happen in his book before he even sits down to write the book. So the book is really almost written before he sits down to write. And then I've interviewed others, and I'm like you. I do sort of a stream of consciousness writing. You sit down, and the ideas and the characters and the situations just sort of flow. And then you go back and you edit to make sure that there's not anything weird that happens. Because the characters really have minds of their own. And I know some of our listeners may be saying, oh, what? But don't you find that that's true when you're writing fiction, that the characters want to do certain things and that they will not do certain things?
I do. I really do. I mean, I was trying to start some new projects, and if the characters don't talk, they don't talk. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was talking to one of my friends yesterday about this new project that I started. I wrote the prologue, and I really didn't know where it was going. And it's this kind of futuristic dystopian thing, and my character decided to be a futuristic serial killer. And I was talking to my friend, and I said, and they decided, and he was like, they? And I was like, well, yeah.
The creative process. I mean, it's really all about the creative process. And you're absolutely right. Somebody who has never experienced that in their head, it does sound like we're from Mars or another planet or something, because it just, that's exactly what happens. And did you find when you were writing your book, Consigned to Oblivion, Cassandra James is your main character. Does she look like you? Does she look like another person? Does she look like someone you know? Was she inspired by somebody? Where did Cassandra James come from in your imagination?
I think looks-wise, she definitely looks a lot like me. Personality-wise, she encompasses a lot of me. That is definitely true, but in a lot of ways, she's also her own person. There's a lot of parts of her that are not part of me, that I took from, like, other people or things I wish I could be, and stuff like that, because I kind of spread myself across the characters, so there's a lot of different aspects of me in characters. Like, one of the side characters, Rachel, is a musician, and she's like me, and then another one of the characters, Maddie, is this very, like, energetic, anxious, stressed, overworked, just kind of a mess of a character, but she's like a quirky kind of a character, and I see a lot of me in that. So
I think you do exactly what fiction writers do. You take a core, and we write what we know, so a core being of a character can be us. But then we look at people that we know, or we look at people that we admire, and we may give that character some of those qualities simply because if we could write ourselves, we might like to write ourselves differently. We might like to give ourselves different qualities than we have. You said you were a musician. What instrument do you play?
I play flute and piccolo.
How did you get into flute and piccolo?
Both of my parents played instruments when they were in high school. My mom played flute, so I'd always pick up her flute and just try to play it. And I started taking lessons in 7th grade, and I started playing in my elementary school in 4th grade, and it kind of just went from there.
You're quite a talented young lady, BC. I have to say that I'm very impressed with your use of language. Now, I have to ask you this because I've read your book, I've read part of your book, I've read some of your blog posts, I've read some of your poetry. Do you just naturally really have this wonderful command of the English language, or is there someone who's editing for you in the background? Because I was so impressed by how you structured, especially the first part of the novel, and the way that you use words. I'm a former English teacher, so I just noticed this stuff. Your use of words, your use of language is quite extraordinary.
Thank you. I actually do write it all myself. I sometimes have people help me with the hard editing, like grammar and stuff, but all the language originates from me.
Are you in AP classes?
Yes, I am.
I thought you had to be. Let's talk a little bit more about the book. Let's give our listeners an overview of Consigned to Oblivion.
Well, Consigned to Oblivion takes the story of Cassandra James, who is 17, starting high school, and she really doesn't know what she's doing with her life. she's had a very tough childhood. She struggles with mental illnesses. She's been in and out of hospitals, running away, and she really doesn't know what direction her life is going to take. And the story really just is that journey, because you see her by herself when she's struggling, and you see her with her friends when she's fine. And there's those two different personalities, and they kind of mix a lot. And in the beginning of the novel, she reconnects with an old friend, which really kind of kicks off the entire thing, because there's this whole thing about forgiveness and mistakes and when are the boundaries between those. And so you follow her relationship with that character through the book. But with that whole thing, she's also finding herself. And she runs away to this secluded world in the woods that she finds, and it has a lake, and it's kind of what I imagine as a sort of like magical place, while not being too unrealistic. And one of my favorite things that I incorporated was there's kind of a double plot line running. And I introduced it kind of halfway through the book, I think, and she's sitting in this world, and she sees the life that she could have had if her life was like almost in a storybook, like if she'd run away and been the main character, but living life exactly the way she wants to. And I incorporate that by using present tense, whereas the rest of the book is written in past tense. So I kind of played with that a lot. I use reality in past tense, and then all the like the kind of twisted reality part in present tense. And so you see that story running a lot. And then halfway through the book, she meets this girl, Lily Peters, and she kind of is the revolutionary point in the book, because she teaches Cassandra more about life than any other character. She's this really spontaneous, witty, very smart character, and she really is the first one to challenge Cassandra's thoughts and ideologies. And so you see them become closer throughout the book, and it's a journey. So the more that the second plot kind of evolves, you see her get a lot more in details about part of it. And by the end of the book, she really kind of has a better idea of life, because she started out with the idea that if there's no point in doing something, there's just no point. So if there's no point in life, there's no point. But she learns that you can't just live to live. You have to live to actually live. And the whole idea of her being consigned to oblivion is that she's consigned to this path that she can't get away from. And the whole book is kind of her trying to figure out how to break it.
Is there a part of the book you'd like to read for us and share with us?
There is, actually. I'm consigned to oblivion, forever consigned to the idea that I can find who I am, that the person I'm looking for is out there somewhere, a pretentious idea formulated in books and movies, idolized and made realistic. Forever consigned to the idea that all I have to do is pull aside a branch, venture underwater, look behind a tree, and there she'll be, waiting, smiling, congratulating me on finally finding her. Forever consigned to the idea that I'm living for something more than the reward of dying, that my place on the earth will not go unnoticed, that as long as I touch someone's life, I will have made my time here worthwhile. Forever consigned to the idea that I'm not consigned to oblivion. I drew a line through the circle. I made indents in the ground, little dots surrounding the circle, within the circle, around the perimeter of the circle. There. I just broke the consignment to oblivion. By breaking off the point of continuation, by creating tears and ripples in the soundness of the line forming a solid ring, unbroken, suddenly broken. That's how simple it should be. Have I broken my consignment to oblivion? Am I one of the dots within the circle? Instead of going around and around, revolving with the predetermined path, am I just standing there, watching it all go by and doing nothing? Watching my life pass by and seeing everything I could have had, watching from within, still able to touch and feel and remember it all, still being a part of it, but not having any of it? Or am I one of the dots outside the circle, standing outside of the predetermined path, having successfully broken away from it, and watching it all go by and doing nothing. Watching my life pass by from afar and seeing everything I used to have. Watching it get farther and farther away, unable to touch and feel and remember it all. Not being a part of it. Knowing that I used to have everything, and now I have nothing? Or am I the line going through it, cutting it off at the source, ending my consignment to oblivion? That's what Dad did. Life hit him a bit too hard, and it took him down. He took all of us down with him. I did that too, in some ways. I always thought that I was saving myself, saving everyone around me from myself. All I did was make it harder for them to stay afloat. All I did was drag them down with me. A ship that sinks and takes all its passengers down with it. I hate myself for that. What's the point of breaking the consignment to oblivion if you break everyone else with it?
Wow, that's very powerful. I love part of the description that calls this an existential coming-of-age story. I'm sure our listeners are curious about where the book is available, and I always go to Amazon to check to see if it's available on Amazon, and certainly there it was. All they have to do is go to Amazon and that search feature at the top. Let me give them the name of the book and your name so they know what to put in the search feature. The name of the book is Consigned to Oblivion by B. C. Hedlund, Hedland. Now, BC, where else could they get a hold of copies of the book?
I am aware that it is currently in Walmart, and it's listed in Goodreads, and there's a list there of a bunch of places that are selling it.
How are they classifying this? As young adult fiction?
Yes.
So they could go to the Walmart website, they could walk into Walmart, they could go to Amazon, anywhere else they could find it?
Not that I know off the top of my head. I know Amazon is the main seller.
Boy, they're the big boy in the bookseller business. You're absolutely right. Now, I know that you're on social media, and I know that you have a website. I went to the website, and it's beautifully done. Let's give the listeners your website address.
My website address is bchedlund.journalportfolio.com.
Now, what will they find when they go to the website?
Well, my homepage pops up with my bio, and then you can pick my short stories, my poems. You can go to my blog, and there's a whole page dedicated to my book.
And there are some excerpts from the book as well on the website. Is that correct?
Yes, there are.
Now, you're doing some other social media. You've got a Facebook page. Let's tell them where your Facebook page can be found.
My Facebook page can be found at BC Hedlund.
And Instagram?
Instagram is b.c.hedlund.
Now, BC, I'm going to ask you a question that I think is really important. I like to give authors the very last word. I like to give you an opportunity to say something to the listeners about your book. I like to let you tell them what you would like for them to take away. So when they close the cover, metaphorically speaking, and put your book away for the last time, what would you like for a reader to have taken away from the book?
Well, I really want them to feel like they've been on the journey with Cassandra, and that they've understood that there are hardships in life and that there are challenges, but that in the end there's always something that makes it worth it. And that sometimes you have to take your head out of all of the chaos and really just let the world kind of take you away with it.
Well, I think you are a very exciting writer, BC, and I'm so glad that you and I had the opportunity to talk today. Thank you so much for joining us on Books on Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now remember, you can find Consigned to Oblivion by B.C. Hedlund on Amazon. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on iTunes as well as iHeartRadio. I'm Suzanne Harris, and I hope you'll join our next Books on Air podcast, because remember, it's the place to be. Thanks so much for listening.